There is a slow hour in every archive, a portion of the day that seems to belong to the dust more than to the living. In that hour the lights thin to a soft, forgiving dim. The servitors lower their voices to the volume of breath. The cogitators that keep the memory of the Imperium humming settle into the small, patient rhythm of a heart asleep. This is the hour the archivist prefers, the hour when the world outside has reduced itself to long distances and muted conflagrations, and the old stones remember nothing but the press of time. Corin Althar kept the hour like a hymn. He had the sort of hands that remember paper through touch alone, fingers threaded with filigree scarwork and calluses left by decades of turning brittle pages. The left hand was more metal than flesh, a graceful lattice of joint and servo that moved with a tenderness one did not expect of iron. He would sit at the long, obsidian table, place a spool of cogitator tape in the cradle, and let the archive breathe with him. There are gestures that make you human again, he told himself, turning a dial, whispering a catalog number into the reader, coaxing images out of silence. These gestures kept his voice within the lineaments of memory. Tonight the archive smelled of cooled iron, old oil, and a faint, sweet perfume of ozone, like the scent that follows lightning on an empty plain. Rain had fallen a day ago across the city below, and the windows were still freckled with small, deliberate drops. Somewhere beyond the vault and the frescoes of mech icons, the horizon was the thin, dull red of a distant war. But inside the archivium the air moved in near silence, measured and slow, and the world outside could only be thought of in the geometric hush that kept the dead from crowding in. The archivium was a cathedral of data. Stone met circuitry at every arch. Fonts of brass bore the omniscience sigils, and long rows of carved alcoves housed spools, hololith cores, and cases of hand-written war letters whose ink had the color of dried blood. It was a place where voices gathered, voices of commanders and mechanical priests, voices of boys and mothers lost to a century of battles, and Corin could coax them into speaking again. He did so with an intimacy bordering on devotion, not simply because knowledge was his duty, but because memory was a kind of prayer. You were not meant to labor alone in such a temple. The Mechanicum sent servitors, the Ecclesiarchy sent decorators, and the Adeptus Administratum sent demands for lists and counts. But this wing, this back alcove of the lower stacks, had been granted to him in private, as if, by accident, the archive itself had chosen a guardian too small to be noticed. He liked that. He liked being small. When the world is large and loud, people tell the same stories, loud versions of their losses, the proud pages of heroism. In the hour Corin preferred, the stories grew softer. He thought of the Emperor not as a throne, but as a slow, patient hand that reached through the galaxy and pulled children from the dark. In the nursery tales, they called those children Primarchs, giants of bone and idea, born of the Emperor's impossible will so that men might have champions. Corin could recite the names on demand, and could trace, with a fingertip, the genealogies that bound chapters to legions. But tonight, he kept the names like lullaby notes, measured and careful. There are, in every large tale, little pockets of absent sound, places where the chorus drops out and silence crowds the words. He had learned to respect those gaps. In the archivium, such gaps were not simple loss. They were often deliberate. The Imperium is a machine that chooses which teeth remain. Some things are polished to shine, others are filed away until they no longer fit the pattern of the machine. The redactions are tidy as a surgeon's scar. You might wonder, if you were less cynical, whether anyone noticed the missing lines. Corin was an archivist. He was always reading the white space between entries. It began as a small curiosity, a catalog entry that refused to match its shelf. He had been calibrating a reader, an antique Lex Mechanicus hands remembered like a lover, when he noticed the anomaly, an index listing for a spool marked with a symbol that had been defaced, as if someone had taken a heated iron to the glyph of a name. Next to the symbol, someone had pressed a single, cruel stamp, erased. He believed in protocol. The Imperial Codex had rhythms and he respected them. Redactions had clerical forms, signatures, and a chain of authority. But the chain that night was broken, the signatures absent. Where duty had been performed, secrecy had performed it differently, quick, neat, and absolute. The spool itself was smaller than he expected. The metal case was cool at his palm, its edge rimmed with a faded color that suggested the sigil of an extinct chapter. No catalog number matched. The embedded glyph had the imprecision of hands that had worked too fast. Corrin set the spool on the reader and let the cradle hum low against his wrist. There was a small, private pleasure in feeling technology settle into old hands, as if his fingers and the machine made a pact. When the Lex mechanic breathed, the first thing he heard was not words but music, the faintest pattern of a hum, like someone singing to themselves in a corridor where the light has already gone. It was not a hymn he recognized, not the formal canticles of the Adeptus or the mechanical mantra of the Omnissiah, but a lullaby, old and irregular, braided with static. The sound brushed his eardrums like a finger across a string and left him with a sense he could not name. Nostalgia for a place he had never been. He would have closed the spool then, filed it among the erased things, and sealed it with the ritual ink, satisfied that curiosity had had its small victory. He did not. There are moments where a small human trait, stubbornness, pity, perhaps the vanity of an archivist who believes himself the only witness to truth, urges you forward. He watched the Lex Mechanic's filament trace lines of code until an image arose in the holoride. It appeared slow, as if the picture were waking from sleep. A corridor, then a high bench, then the tilt of a child's head lit by something bright and wrong. It was an image that made him remember everything and nothing. Two small figures, indistinct at first then, when the feed stabilized, larger than children but smaller than the giants inked in the great histories. They were not in armor. Their hair was not the braids of regiments. They held in their hands small carved things, a toy that looked like an engine, a fragment of a gear. One of them turned, and Corrin felt it like a current. The angle of the face suggested a likeness he had only seen in broken statues and in portraits redacted from the canvases of official halls. The feeling was better than recognition and stranger than grief. The Lex Mechanic stuttered. Static filled the spool. Where speech should have been, there was an echo that bore the pattern of a human voice but was not human. Layered, slowed, and threaded with an undertone that made the hair at the nape of his neck raise. It might have been wind or ritual chant or a machine trying to imitate a lullaby. He could not be sure. But in that thinned music was a sense of being known, like a name voiced in a dream. A small thing happened then that told him this spool had not been erased because of clerical tidiness. A servitor in the far stack, one of those maintenance bodies that hummed like a dim star, halted in its work. The arm that carried a dust shroud drooped, and the servitor emitted a single, low cough of gears. In the stillness that followed, the archive seemed to hold its breath. Corrin pressed his gloved thumb to the edge of the holoride and felt the warmth of the spool. The label, if it had been present, had been scrubbed. But someone, perhaps in a hurry or in a mercy no protocol could explain, had left one fragment of writing in the margin, 2 words in an official hand, but written more like a note made under a pillow. Hidden children. It should have been a phrase he could fold into the other phrases of the Imperium, the same height as lost legion and untold regret. But it did not rest. The syllables sat in his mouth like a seed that knows it will take root. In the long, slow hour of the archives, one learns to measure danger by its quiet. He felt something small but insistent, curiosity braided with the thread of dread. He set the spool aside with the formal air of one who puts down a candle, but his hands did not depart from the cradle. Outside the vault, the city breathed deeper as night deepened. The rain settled into the gutters like voices running down a face. Inside, Corrin found himself listening for the echo of the lullaby, for the reprise he could not shake. Sometimes an archivist is only a keeper of names. Sometimes the keeper uncovers a name that insists it be kept differently, held, Wade watched. He wrapped the spool in cloth and placed it in a case that matched no index. He wrote nothing in the ledger that night. The omission felt, perversely and exultantly, like an oath. The Lex Mechanic purred and the servitors resumed their soft chores, but Corrin did not sleep. He stepped to the long window and watched the rain smear the horizon until the line between ground and sky was a bruise. He thought of the tailies, of fathers pulling children from the dark, of hands forming armor and law. He wondered, with the small, guilty warmth of a man who reads forbidden things, what might be kept so secret. He did not know then the shape of what would unfurl from that small spool. He did not know that the lullaby would return in dreams, that it would alter the count of his waking breaths, that the 2 words scrawled in the margin would become the rhythm he could not forget. He only knew that he had found a place where silence had been made, and that silence had been, somehow, unfinished. He smiled once, small and private, as if apologizing to an old friend. Then he sat and the archive leaned close, ready to tell him what it had been forced to forget. There is a language to secrecy. The Imperium speaks it in margins and seals, in the absence between entries, in the tiny, officious stamps that mark an item as purged, sealed, forbidden. Corrin had learned that language as one learns a native tongue, by listening to the silences as much as to the words. He had been an archivist long enough to know the difference between a lost thing and a thing made lost. The first is victim to time, the second is victim to intention. The spool, small, defaced, humming the memory of a lullaby, was the latter. It was not simply missing, it had been made to disappear. The procedural work of uncovering such a thing is unglamorous. It is less like digging and more like patient surgery. Corrin began, as all good surgeons do with instruments. He lit the reader and ran the Lex Mechanic's diagnostics. The filaments thrummed, the diagnostic glyphs streamed in a slow green along the display, and the cradle whispered the machine's acknowledgement. In the lower racks, servitors moved in their soft choreography, arms like slow bellows, eyes blinking schematically. The gallery hummed with the small mechanical music of the archive, an engine symphony that made Corrin think of heartbeats. He preferred this music. It kept him honest. Decryption is a ritual. The first layer is mechanical. 1, physical inspection for tampering, heat scars, abrasions, signs of hurry. 2, run the physical cipher through the Lex Mechanic's basic table to resolve the original substrate. 3, perform a checksum scan and reconcile mismatches with backup shards. He followed each step with the devotion of a liturgist. The spool yielded information in reluctant fragments, a host template in truncated code, a seal glyph with its outer ring scorched, and most peculiarly, a hand-etched marginalia in a human script that had been smudged after being quickly written. When the basic code did not match, Corrin invoked a secondary instrument, the dendritic reader. It was an antique, a machine older than his own recollection of youth, whose filament was as fine as spun glass and whose algorithms traced memory paths rather than static blocks. The reader maps data as a tree, roots, trunks, branches, allowing the mind to follow associative links instead of strict index paths. The dendritic reed unraveled the spool as if it were a life. A child's laughter at the roots, a corridor at the trunk, and at the furthest branches, the kind of details that made the hair at the back of his neck rise. He calibrated mnemonic filters next. These were not simple decoders. They were psychological dampers, devices meant to protect the reader from the corrosive effects of some archival contents, especially those laced with psychic bleed or purposely engineered mimetic hazards. The filters were glass and bronze, threaded with micro-etchings of anti-echo sigils. Corrin set each dial to the customary safety margin, low enough to hear emotion, high enough to keep it from eating at his sense of self. He had always left a sliver of risk. Curiosity is a corrosive that works best with light exposure. As the dendritic reed unfurled, the spool's memory did not present as tidy narrative. It had been damaged, deliberately or by age. It came as a collage, half phrases stitched to images, voice logs that began and cut out, diagrams that showed geometry of bone and gene like a mathematical prayer. What it lacked in continuity, it made up for in implication. There were, scattered like the remnants of an interrupted dream, the briefest references to incubation, to lullaby mesh, to incision lines annotated with human names that had been scored out with a heated stylus. Here and there the Imperial seal appeared, but altered, its 8-pointed star rendered with an extra notch, an addition so minute as to be almost indistinguishable unless one was looking for betrayal in a sigil. The Lex Mechanic whispered, and the archive became a chamber of breath. Through the headphones the voice logs came as fragments of speech, a voice rough with sleep or with tired authority. And if the gene, then an abrupt cut, bind the children to, and staticky interference. We cannot trust the, and a metallic cough that had to be a servitor or a human trying to mimic one. Corin slowed the playback, unspooled the phonemes like beads. The dendritic path led always back to two figures, always to pairs. References to sibling, mirror, fold, and chillingly, erasure. When a spool is contaminated, one that has either been intentionally infected with psychically resonant content, or which carries the psychic imprint of traumatic events, certain mechanical responses occur automatically. Servitors will balk in the presence of such material. Tape filaments will microfracture if they sense hostile frequencies. The archive's sentinel programs will flag anomalies in the index. Corin had experienced these before in less consequential matters. Childlike deaths on peripheral worlds, the last transmissions of a planetary governor before being consumed by Xenos. But there was a specificity here that made his fingers tremble. The dendritic reeds showed echoes, like rings around a fallen stone. Each playback created a new ring, and with each ring the voice logs grew more ghostly, as though someone or something else was singing along in the margins. He did not hear anything out of the ordinary at first. Then, in the part of the feed where two voices overlapped, one thin and childish, the other deeper and impatient, the Lex Mechanic presented an image. A corridor lined in pale stone, a pattern of gears embedded into the tiles, the flicker of a torch that might have been flame or might have been some engineered light. The two figures were at the corridor's center, clutching small objects like talismans. The scene had a domesticity that jarred against the presence of steel. There were toys here, tiny models of engines, a looped cord like a cradle's rope, and yet the air tasted of antiseptic and overheated metal. Children, thought Corin. The word was almost vulgar in the context of the great narratives that chose giants for heirs. If Primarchs were hulks and avatars, then these were in between. Limbs oversized but not yet armored, faces that suggested purpose rather than charisma. They behaved not like toddlers but like something that knew its own otherness, a mixture of human warmth and a cold mechanical mimicry. One of them hummed something under his breath. The melody was the same lullaby Corin had heard in the spool's opening. It had an odd, off-rhythm cadence, a hesitation that made it sound like someone learning to remember a song. The dendritic reader marked associative links, names, faces, catalog numbers that corresponded with defunct regimental patches. It was not the kind of record the Empire normally allowed itself to harbor, private experiments lost in the folds of official secrecy. Each link bore the signature of variables, gene seed sequences with annotations in a hand that was not uniform. Different hands had worked this data, hands with varying slants, as if many minds had passed the spool and left a trace. He should have been alone with the spool's truth, combing for meaning the way a priest combs rosary beads. Instead, he was not. Someone had left a mark upon the archive, a note beneath the crate where he had found the spool. It was a small thing, a scrap of parchment folded twice and tucked between two spools. Corin opened it with fingers that had learned the etiquette of sacred objects and read the script. Do not proceed alone. There are watchers in the silence. No signature. The ink had been applied with a citizen's hand, quick, steady, someone who was literate but not clerical. The message had the economy of someone who had to whisper orders in corridors where ears could listen. He was not yet afraid. Corin is not a man given to theatrics. He liked to think methodical. He notified no one. That, perhaps, was the first step toward anything resembling madness, the private keeping of a secret. He packed the spool in the same cloth and set it on the cradle. He increased the mnemonic filter slightly so the impressions would be gentler on his mind. He told himself he would merely run a full dendritic read, record observations for the record, and then present the item to the proper channels. That was the lawful thing to do. Law had always felt like warmth. The archive, however, has its own slow logic. Machines listen. They catalog not only data but the pattern of attention. Somewhere in the racks, a maintenance servitor initiated its hourly sweep. It was an old thing, patched and repatched, its designation plate nearly illegible, SVR-06 thimble. Corin had seen it before. It had a tremor in its arm, a corrosion on its base. Tonight the servitor's sweep stalled midline. One of its servos caught, and it emitted a noise that should have been mechanical and sterile. A cough. The sound was small, an odd little clanking as if a throat had rasped. The servitor's ocular diodes brightened, then dimmed, and for an instant its head tilted in a manner that suggested the attention of a living creature rather than a machine. Corin waited for the servitor to redress itself. Machines often flinched when encountering contaminated data. It was a safety measure coded into their routines. But the servitor did not resume immediately. Instead, it extended its arm in Corin's direction, unused behavior, unprogrammed, and in its palm a small drop of lubricant trembled, catching the light like a tiny star. The servitor projected a single sentence in the linguivox, not from its vocalizer, but as a thin line of caption across its ocular display. Remove spool. Danger. Unknown. The script was glitchy, the letters jagged from some internal misalignment. But the meaning was clear. Corin smiled, a small and private thing. It was the smile of a man who understands a joke whispered in the dark. He told himself the servitor was malfunctioning, that its protocols had misapplied the contamination filter. He had seen servitors make mistakes, many had in their long service, and he had repaired them with oil and the patience of one who tended fragile things. He replaced the servitor's lubricant canister and adjusted its power feed, checking its logs for commentary. The log showed an unusual spike in activity in the last cycle, a detection event in the spool's cluster that should not have been possible given the seal level. The spike was annotated with a glyph he did not recognize, an almost complete omnissiah sigil, with the lower quadrant scratched through. That scratch was a designer's thumbprint. It was not random. The notch cut into the sigil's curve made Corin think of finality. Something deliberate had been excised from the Imperium's iconography itself. He replayed the dendritic overlay and stared at the index positions where the signature should have been. Indices were neat things. They told you where to look, who had touched what and when. Here, in place of the neat names, there was only cold, blank space, as if hands had been removed from a ledger and their shadows left behind. He could have presented this discovery to the ecclesiarchy, to the adeptus administratum, to the mechanicum. Instead, he walked to the alcove where the mechanicum's emissary worked, a man more machine than priest, Magos Threvel, a tech priest of some repute, with the brass crescents grafted to his skull and the respectful murmur of cogitators embedded at his temples. Threvel was an old acquaintance of the archives, a man whose methods were lawful and whose warnings bore the weight of mechanical irony. When one confided in a Magos, one expected either condemnation or approval. Corin hoped for neither. He wanted only to hear a voice that might make sense of the scratch. Threvel was at his bench, surrounded by diagrams and a pile of scorched servitor parts. He turned his ocular implants toward Corin with a slowness designed to be both attentive and mildly disconcerting. He smelled of hot copper and resin. His fingers, if they could still be called fingers, flicked with practiced impatience. "You have been playing with a warm thing," Threvel said without preamble. His tone had the cadence of oil on metal, smooth, slightly abrasive. He did not ask permission to view the spool. The archive was an open book to him. Corrin set the cradle between them and let Threvel run a cursory glance. The Magos hummed. Curious. The splice is not standard. Whoever handled this used a field suppressor on the index. Not simply redaction, active excision. He tapped a series of runes on his console, and a magnified image of the scratch closed in. The Omnissiah sigil's lower quadrant, C. The notch is not simply defacement. It is a cipher, a seal of unacknowledgement. Who carries that authority? Corrin felt the old, certain chill of a man who has located a wrongness in the world's grammar. I do not know. There is a scrap, someone left a note. Do not proceed alone. The servitor nearly refused to touch the item. It projected a warning. Threvel's implants flickered. For a moment the Mago's expression, such as it could be called expression, tightened in a way that suggested unease. Servitors can be sensitive to paramimetic echoes, he said, but there was a catch in his voice. They can also be trained to mimic sensitivity. A seal of unacknowledgement is used rarely, and always by those who seek to remove a subject from the pattern of official concern. It is used by judicators, sometimes by the High Lord's private offices, and occasionally by other hands. He paused, seeking a word that would not betray a line he was taught to avoid pronouncing. By other hands. The absence of a phrase is a phrase. Corrin noticed it as if it were a shift in the air. Threvel tapped his console and summoned an auxiliary script, one that would attempt to reconstitute scribal hands. The algorithm cross-referenced the striations of the marginalia and suggested candidates. The list came back with 3 names and 2 null results. No official clerical signature matched. Someone with authority has attempted to drape invisibility across this spool, Threvel said. He looked at Corrin as if giving counsel to a patient, not an accomplice. You should not play with things that have been unmade. The archive is full of ghosts who prefer to remain dead. Who else would? Corrin began, but Threvel closed the question with a small motion. Many who fear the possibility of contagion, biological, psychic, mimetic. Many who hold hands too tightly and believe a cut is mercy. He reached for a small implement and ran it along the spool's rim. The metal sang under his probe like a bell. You have pulled a small thread, Corrin. Threads tend to lead to seams. Threvel's warning was not dramatic. It never was. Tech priests do not enjoy melodrama. They prefer the steady application of force and the economy of an incision. He said, finally, if you continue, calibrate your mnemonic filters to the 2nd degree and bring me a printout of all associated index paths. I will run an augmented dendritic align to see whether the spool is a splice or an original ledger. If it is splice, if someone has sewn it into the archive, then the hands involved are multiple and practiced. Corrin did as he was told. He raised the mnemonic filter, not to block experience, but to allow it through in small, comprehensible segments. He ran the dendritic align Threvel suggested, the machine sighing like a man straining to remember. The align produced a map of associative clusters. The strongest cluster was not data but sensation. In the center of that map was a pattern his mind could not at first name, a pattern that felt like waiting. There were physical signs of tampering throughout the linked indices, entries removed in sequences spaced to mimic loss rather than targeted deletion, dates that slid one into another like footsteps across a muddy field. Names had been trimmed from lists of recovering regiments. Mentions of an experiment had been rendered into shorthand that only an initiated hand could parse. For each act of removal, the signature pattern narrowed. Not a scattered vandalism, but a steady, surgical removal. Legislative timestamps had been altered. A deletion here was followed by an insertion there that suggested a rewriting of history rather than its simple censorship. The deeper he read, the more Corrin felt a small, insistent presence settle at the edge of his perception. It was like being watched not by a visible face, but by the ledger itself, the weight of attention radiating from a clustered node of data. At first he put it down to fatigue or the subtle effect of mnemonic dampening. He had, after all, raised the filter. But the feeling grew in a manner that had a logic of its own. Not fear, not curiosity, but recognition. He could not locate the origin. The dendritic map suggested two convergent nodes of memory, two centers of gravity that the spool attached to over and over. The cluster had a resonance that, when stimulated by playback, moved something in his chest like a distant bell. He began to hear the lullaby off stage. Not in full, but as a motif. A three-note fall, a broken cadence, then a lingering vibration that left a metallic taste on the tongue. It appeared between entries, in the space where code should have been, as if the archive itself had taken the spool and hummed it to itself at night. Corrin blinked and saw briefly, a shadow moving in the periphery of his vision. When he turned, there was nothing but a stack of battered hololith cases, their tags faded. He did not tell Threvel about the lullaby. Tech priests do not speak of subjective experience the way human clerics might. They quantify, they measure, they transcode. But Threvel did notice something else. A faint alteration in the spool's electromagnetic signature that suggested it had once been stored against a living biofield. Stored against a living mind, Threvel said, either as a cache, an emergency measure to keep data coherent, or as a lock. Whoever did this knew something about using living flesh as a substrate. The idea was obscene in its intimacy. Data stored against a living mind implied a link between memory and person, so close the boundary between them blurred. It implied that identity itself might be used as a hard drive. Corrin tasted copper. He thought of the two small figures in the corridor, and the way their hands had cradled tiny engines. He thought of hands, of the careful, scarred hands that might have held this spool and pressed the words hidden children into the margin. He thought privately of the word children and felt a complex knot of shame and awe. They worked into the late cycle. Threvel's algorithms drew maps and printed them in graphite-scented strips. The dendritic reader sketched branching trees that showed overlapping associations, names that belonged to regiments not listed in canonical histories, birth dates that had been painted over with broad strokes, annotations in a hand that suggested an intimate author, someone who had observed rather than issued orders. It read like the private notes of a mid-level officer who had become complicit in secrecy. As the maps accrued, the notion of the Emperor's hand became less metaphor and more a physical presence in the material. The altered sigils repeated with a pattern, not across administrative filings, but across devices associated with genetic work, incubators, lab index numbers, the sort of places the Mechanicum would touch, but not the ecclesiarchy. Someone with jurisdiction over both medicine and secrecy had signed these changes. That someone had not acted alone. When Corrin presented the compiled indices to Threvel, the Mago's ocular diodes flashed in a way that suggested comprehension and discomfort. He looked finally at Corrin and said quietly, "This pattern, these removals, have the character of a council decision. It is the signature of a body that decides the fate of things not fit for public knowledge. Not the High Lords as a corporate unit, but the kind of committee that acts to shield its own conscience. The choice to excise is, in the hands of such bodies, a kind of mercy or a calculation of risk." Corrin thought of children as instruments in the hands of men who would call a choice mercy. The word pried at his ribcage like a knife. He wanted answers with the hunger of a man who has been given a half-portrait of a beloved. But answers in the Imperium come attached to obligations. Asking for them necessitates placing evidence in channels that can weaponize truth or bury it. There were other warnings. A scribal ledger from a lesser office, one that recorded the transfer of materials between ships, had an entry that read in the blunt, bureaucratic canon of the administratum: transfer, confidential, unnumbered, removed from registry. It was dated to a year for which official histories gave no record of such a transfer. A later entry referenced a private purge undertaken on the orders of and left a blank where the ordering authority should have rested. Blanks in ledgers are like teeth missing from a face. They change the balance of everything. The archive, for all its machinery and engravings, had begun to take on the pall of a living thing with a wound. The dampers Corin had calibrated seemed less to shield him than to invite the spool's contents to audition themselves in segments small enough for his mind to digest. The lullaby returned again and again, like an insect at a window, insistent and delicate at once. It lodged itself in the spaces between pages, in the left margin of an index, in the noise of a servitor's cough. It made him dream in fractal images. Two hands in a bowl, kneading metal like dough. A child's face turning toward a light that was neither sun nor star. A ledger with names that, when read aloud, sounded like prayers and curses indistinguishable. Once in the small hours, Corin slept at his table for a moment. He dreamed he was young again, in a courtyard where the rain hit the stones in a slow, steady pattern. A child offered him a small toy engine, and in its center was etched a tiny sigil, a notch in a star. He woke with fingers curled around the dream as if it were a physical object. The clock on the wall recorded nothing more sinister than the passing of minutes, but his prosthetic hand twitched in a way that made him think of muscle memory responding to a presence. If this spool had been a simple artifact, some experimental record of a failed Astartes variant, the file would have been handed to the Mechanicum for sterilization. If it had been a failed psychic experiment, the Inquisition might have annexed it for study or destruction. The pattern Corin traced suggested something else, a long, careful act of removal that stretched across offices and years. It suggested a corporate decision to lop an entire branch from the family tree. It suggested the presence of two nodes, two names, that had been struck from the ledger by a body frightened of what their continued mention might provoke. The idea of excising children from history, of cutting them away as if they were diseased limbs, was a cruelty so precise it felt almost rational. He thought of the Emperor as the old Thales rendered him, a patient architect planning through centuries, calculating at scales human minds could not fathom. In that light, the removal might have been a strategic excision, a utilitarian subtraction to preserve a greater design. But the sight of the scratch in the sigil suggested not only strategy, but the hand that does not hesitate at erasure. Late in the cycle, when the stack lights had thinned, and the servitor's movements had become measured to sleep, a figure approached the archive's modest door, an ecclesiarchal minor, a woman with the plain robe of the lower clergy and a voice that did not try to carry beyond her cheeks. She did not come with an escort. She stood at the threshold for a long moment and then entered without a sound. Corin looked up and recognized her by the small, stern fold at the corner of her mouth. She had been assigned to catalog small devotional items recovered from battlefronts. She knew the language of relics. "You should not be alone," she said, which was not a question. Her eyes flicked to the cradle and then to the spool. "You should not be alone," he repeated, the phrase now tasting of recency. "I have the spool." She was not fazed. "There are thighs that have hidden bones for reasons of mercy," she said. "There are minds that the High Lords have decided should not be awake. We keep bodies from remembering because our wars cannot bear their complications." Corin felt the air cold around his lungs. "Who writes those decisions?" The cleric shrugged nearly imperceptibly. "Many hands. The Council for Exclusion is a rumor that is also a thing. There are committees that prefer to decide without being named. The Empire is a machine built by men who make choices for others." Her voice had the blunt compassion of someone who had been trained to close wounds before they festered. "If you seek them, you will find silence and paper where a name should be." She touched the edge of the spool and then withdrew her fingers as if burned. "Take care with living archives," she said. "They feed on remembrance." Corin took that sentence into the night like a wound. He had catalogued relics for years, and thus knew that religious folk could be as hard as the Mechanicum in their austerity. But the cleric's words had an edge of pain he had seen in the eyes of people who had been present at a necessary cruelty. She did not counsel him to turn over the spool to the proper channels. She told him softly that what he did next would mark him. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the table and listened to the archive murmur. Each of the machines hummed its slow complaint. The servitor's ocular diodes blinked. The lullaby rose once more from the cradle of the spool, like steam from a kettle left to breathe on a cold morning. Corin watched, and in the watching a decision anchored itself. He would not bring this to the High Lords. He would not let bureaucracy render the two words into official ash. He would read the spool through to its end and then decide what to do. When dawn came, it found him pale and wire-strung. The dendritic reader had drawn a wider map. The nodes converged into two centers of mass, two names that, for all the scratches and redactions, remained only half erased. They were not in the official lists of Primarchs. They were not played in the nursery tales. Yet their trace ran through institutions. A nursery ledger tucked inside a mechanicum crate, a letter from a battlefield medic mentioning a child who would wake and sing of gears, a bartered fragment of gene seed that had been sold, and then quietly bought back into an unlisted hold. Corin placed the printed maps before Threvel. The Magos examined them, his ocular diodes slicing through the paper with heat-mapped patience. "You have found a pattern," he said. "You have also found risk." He added almost as an afterthought, "If you continue, you will not only read them, they will read you." Corin did not yet understand the full meaning of Threvel's sentence. He could not have known that the spool's lullaby would become the rhythm of his nights, that it would sit like a seed behind his ribs and unfurl in the shapes of memory he had not owned. He could not know, then, that the act of following the dendritic branches would bring him into a conversation with a past engineered to be silent, that those conversations would sometimes be mediated by living things whose consent had been purchased in omission. He thought only of the scrap of paper tucked beneath the crate and the simple admonition it carried: "Do not proceed alone." He thought of the servitor's cough and of the cleric's voice. He thought of two names half-white on a ledger. He sealed the maps in a privacy envelope and took a key from Threvel's bench, a slender token stamped with glyphs that permitted restricted access to a subset of the lower vaults. The Magos slid the key across the work surface with mechanical gentleness. "Take only what you must," Threvel advised, "and do not let your filters slip." The Magos looked at him, at Corin's hand, at the way his fingers trembled, and added quietly, "Remember, not all erasures are mercy. Some are excision, and there is a difference." Corin pocketed the key and felt the future sharpen into a decision. The archive's machinery kept its slow, impartial beat, as if everything in the world were still ordered and lawful. But beneath that machine, beneath the stacks and the filaments and the careful sigils, a hole had been cut. Two names lay in its blackness, hollowed out by hands that did not wish the world to look. He walked out of the mechanicum alcove with the key in his palm, the scent of hot copper and resin clinging to him like prophecy. Outside, the city's war-scurred rooftops were a serrated silhouette. Gulls or perhaps maintenance drones cried in the high sky. The rain had stopped. In the far distance, a campaign banner hung twisted on a spar. In his pocket, the dendritic maps rustled, and somewhere, like a ghost in a borrowed instrument, a lullaby repeated itself, soft and patient and terrible in its insistence. He had, for the first time in his life, chosen to follow a silence. That choice, he knew quietly and with the terrible clarity of a man stepping into cold water, would change the ledger of him. He had, by looking, invited attention. The archive, which had been a cathedral of memory and a safe harbor for the dead, was now a thing with edges. It had begun to look back. The spool waited in its cloth, patient as a closed eye. Corin passed his thumb over the material and felt, absurdly, like someone touching a sleeping forehead. He unlocked the key, and with it the path into the lower vaults, the places the mechanicum reserved for things it could not explain, and the ecclesiarchy preferred not to touch. The air that rose from below had the scent of old iron and old decisions. He descended. The arch of the door closed behind him with the soft, certain finality of a seal. Dreams seeped from the cracks an hour before dawn. In the archivium, they come like condensation, thin, almost invisible, then gathering into something wet and heavy enough to stain cloth. Corin had thought himself practiced in dreams. An archivist learns to live between waking and recording, to sleep with one hand on the ledger, so that sleep will not take the wrong notes. But the spool had threaded its motif into his nights like a foreign tune slid under his pillow. The lullaby, 3 notes folded and folded again until it became a chain, entered his sleep and arranged his thoughts into patterns that were not his own. The first dream felt like a memory he had never had. He stood in a hall of bronze and rain. The floor was a tessellation of gears, each tooth turned to match an impossible clock. Children, small and angular, ran between columns, their feet silent as if the stone itself had learned to carry them. One reached toward him with a palm brightened by a smear of oil, and offered a toy no bigger than a cog. A miniature engine wound closed with a tiny leather strap. When he took it, the toy's gears spun a moment and then stopped. The lullaby slid across his throat in a taste of oil and lemon, and he woke with his hand clenched as if around something small and metallic. The second dream was not a place but a voice. It was layered, 2 tones that fit together, like a resonant metal reacting to a calm hammer. He could not say whether one voice belonged to a child or to a machine. Both voices carried a tenderness he had not expected to find alongside the industry of the mechanicum. They chanted again and again, in a cadence that first soothed and then wound tighter around the mind. It was not a melody he had right to keep. He woke with the echo in his implants, a faint ringing that made speech feel far from the lips. When morning finally cut its thin line beneath the vault door, Corin found himself not more rested but more alert in a dangerous way, the kind of attention that reads patterns in things meant to be read as blanks. He had expected, as any reasonable man expects of his profession, to find more spools and more signatures, and perhaps an institutional hand that could be traced and presented. Instead, the ledger of the lower vaults behaved like a living thing protecting a wound. The deeper he probed, the more the archive seemed to compartmentalize its pain. Paths closed behind him. Index entries became blurred as if ink had been licked away. Searches produced stunted trees with their top branches sheared. He adjusted the mnemonic filter until the hum of the cradle sat just beneath the threshold of the small voices the spool had left in him. He made lists as he had been taught to make lists when alone. Sequence of spools to examine, cross-reference tags, physical inspection priorities. The list itself was an anchor. He rationalized the unease. The dreams were likely the spillover of paramimetic residue, a real possibility when memory had been stored against living tissue, as Threvel had said. He told himself he could make the distinction between dream and evidence. He told himself these were tools, not wounds. The first sign the archive itself had noticed his attention came from the logs. He was tracing an index path when his console flashed the terse line every archivist dreads. Query REDACTED, access DENIED. The line should have been bureaucratic, impersonal, but the font that printed it on his screen mimicked an admonition. It felt as if someone had drawn breath through a closed throat. He ran the trace. The trace led not to a committee or a channel, but to a process identifier he did not know. Null-Red 7. Machine processes are as revealing as handwritten notes in a ledger. They have idiosyncrasies, timestamps, the faint signature of the technician who tuned them. Null-Red 7's signature was thin and surgical, like an implement sharpened for the task of cutting memory. It had been run in cycles at odd hours across multiple indices, an automated redaction process, one that did not so much remove as unwrite. When Corin called the process to the surface for a look, the console returned only an error. Access frame CORRUPTED. The error had the polite indifference of a labyrinth. He felt, in that small moment, a pressure on the chest like the year he had been present at the purge of a cult on a small star farm. An industrial necessity. He had been told then, with the same language, the same certainties. But those purges had been clean. There had been files and signatures and the smell of burned paper. This was neater, a mechanized forgetting. It was as if authority had domesticated the concept of loss. Corin attempted to follow the lineage of the spool's associations, where the machine allowed him. He found fragments that tugged at the silent thread. A medic's note transcribed into a backup hololith, a nurse's hand-drawn sketch of a child's face with its eyes crossed out in a caretaker's panic, a ledger entry from a ship's manifest that had been given the blunt annotation, subject transferred, unnumbered. In the data overlays he found, as on a palimpsest, an earlier mark, an inscription that flickered between official lexicons and something almost like marginalia, the same notch in the star motif he had seen in the spool's scratch. The more he read, the more the archive seemed to surface a constancy. The spool's memory did not belong to a single author, but to a sequence of caretakers. Each had applied a slightly different hand to the record. The pencil strokes varied, the pressure changed, and the notes sometimes bore the tiny idiosyncrasy of a human being. A shorthand for a name, a stutter in a date. The living imprint was the unpleasant proof that these documents had not always been mere data. They had been held. It was during one of those traces that something new happened to his console. A message layer unfurled as if inside the screen itself, thin like a breath of smoke. We observe. Do not proceed. It was unsigned. For a moment he felt foolish. Ghost texts sometimes appear as automatic guard messages from maintenance processes. But the message was not a standard warning. The glyph style was older, with an ornamental curl the administratum used in private memos. The message was not machine in its authorship. He traced the provenance and found while his query lines slid like shadows under bricks. The process null red 7 had been invoked in the same rack where his spool had been stored weeks earlier. The implication of collocation tightened his mouth. Who had noticed the spool and done nothing? Who had chosen, instead, to begin the deliberate act of unmaking? If someone had wanted the spool erased, why leave the two words in the margin? Hidden children, as if teasing a hand over a wound and then pulling back. There was a cruelty to the gesture and a vanity to it as well. A deliberate breadcrumb. He thought of people who, in their last acts, wanted to be heard even if future hands would smother the sound. The idea made the air taste of iron. As the days folded, Corin's waking life and the spool's echoes braided. The lullaby motif, its three-note fall and reverberant aftersigh, made itself at home at the edge of his cognition. It appeared in his work. A servitor's motor would whir to the same ratio. A factional bell would toll with a pattern his mind registered as the second half of the lullaby. The motif began to act as a key. When it sounded, his console's protected clusters trembled awake. He learned to listen. When the lullaby appeared somewhere, some redaction process was likely to have run. He confided, not to Threvel, not yet, for the Magos had the kind of prudence that could close pathways, but to a person he thought of as a repository of rumor, a woman named Lervas, an exile who sold battlefield relics and stories from a rented stall in the market above the Archivium. She was neither cleric nor tech priest. Her trade was memory for coin, and she kept things that official hands deemed sentimental. Corin found her when he wanted to feel the item he had not yet dared to make public. She wore a scarf the color of dried blood, and had the look of someone who had seen shapes of truth but never the whole truth. Lur listened without surprise when he told her he had found an erased spool. She did not ask for the spool itself. She only folded her hands and humored his questions, as one humors a child asking where light goes when the sun sleeps. There are always fringe things, she said finally, things men make to hack the machine of war. The Mechanicum will build a cradle for anything if they believe it will deliver advantage. Sometimes they birth wonders, sometimes monsters, sometimes both. Do you know of 2 lost Primarchs? Corin asked, feeling ridiculous as he gave the phrase voice. She shrugged. Children are many things when we wish them so, but sometimes the stories line up. She touched her scarf. Under it, at the hollow of her neck, a small scrap of cloth peered, folded and careful. She removed it and handed it to him. It was a knitted thing, the size of a coin, with a tiny embroidered notch cut into the edge of a star. Corin looked at it and tried to keep his breath even. The motif matched the scratch in the spool's sigil like a dovetail. "Where did you get this?" he asked. She smiled without humor. "A woman left it here once in exchange for a phrase book. She said she did not want the child to remember a name. She did not say which name, and the name is not always the point. Remembering is a hunger." Corin had noticed that memory as hunger. He had watched men at the edges of morning lean toward a scrap of cloth like light seeking a lens. He wondered why the woman would barter such a small thing. "Who was the mother?" he asked, the question heavy with the kind of administrative import his life otherwise reserved for paper. Lur's smile softened into something like caution. "There are mothers for whom the Imperium offers only choices. They trade the right to remember for small things, peace, a place in a nursery, a ration card." She folded the scrap back into her scarf. "I do not trade in judgments. I trade in the small proofs. Keep it. It will tell you when the lullaby is near." The lullaby came nearer faster after the exchange. It no longer waited for the cradle alone. It threaded itself into public life with the subtlety of a virus. He heard it in the broken cadence of a Vox transmission rerouted through a makeshift relay. He heard it in the groan of an old lift. He even heard it, once, as if the city itself had learned to remember, in the tapping of a child's spoon against her bowl in a market stall. It was impossible to tell whether these were coincidences or the spool's way of making itself known through the smallest, most human channels. As his nights filled with the motif, so did his body show the spool's attention in small, private ways. The first symptom was a tremor in his prosthetic hand. The left servo would twitch in the exact rhythm of the lullaby when he tried to steady a pen. It was slight at first, a micro-shiver of gears, the kind of thing a technician might dismiss as wear. But then his vocal implant, older and less perfect than his mechanical hand, began to produce static at the end of certain notes when he read entries aloud. The static matched a frequency printed, in a rare laboratory note, as a potential carrier frequency for mimetic locks. The engineers who designed voice encryption had thought such carriers purely mechanical. The idea that an emotional melody could act as a carrier for memory felt obscene and too intimate. He guarded these symptoms for fear of ridicule. The mechanicum might fix machines. The ecclesiarchy might call him possessed. It is an isolating thing, the feeling that your body keeps a secret you yourself cannot wholly own. He measured his pulse, checked servitor logs for interference, upped the mnemonic filters. For a few hours the tremors subsided. Then they returned stronger, more insistent, as if the lullaby were learning the shape of his hands. The archive's reaction to his increased activity became more direct. He found, in the communal public log, a terse notation that someone had accessed the spool's rack without authorization. No signature, only a timestamp and an administrative hash. That hash matched, to his dismay, not a mechanicum node but a file associated with the Office of Redaction, an agency rumor-soft and real. The office's official function was sedate, to ensure national security, to protect the empire from panic or contamination. Its unofficial function, the thing people whispered about in low booths, was more frightening. It made choices about which pasts could survive. He tried to petition the office. The request was answered not by an official but by a single line of text left anonymously on his console. "Do not make US remember." The language had the impersonal menace of something professionalized. Corin felt suddenly infantile, a man admonished by the very thing that should be neutral and clerical. And then the chase began. It was small at first. An index he had printed to his bench would appear re-inked in different numerals by the time he returned from the latrine. A hololith he had intended to rehydrate returned with the playback seamed out in the middle. Once, when he tried to copy a cluster for Threvel, the cluster replied with the archival equivalent of a shrug. Contents unavailable. At night he would open his personal log to discover entries he had not made. Lines of commentary that complicated the record with half-smiles and cynical asides. He suspected and then confirmed that someone, something, was following the routes he traced, padding steps behind him, re-indexing fibers he had just pulled. The figure behind the padding was not human to the eye. The first trace of a personal agent came when Corrin received a message file, disguised as a maintenance note, that contained an avatar, a rendered face carved by an algorithm to look like a neutral face. The avatar spoke with the smoothness of a voice synthesized to avoid mannerisms. Its name flickered in small red letters at the base of the frame. Redactor cipher, HARR. The message read, "You are stepping into a security field. Cease your activity for the protection of yourself and the public record. There are consequences to knowledge." The tone was bland and bureaucratic, but the grammar carried an edge of threat, as if carved into a bone. Corrin answered because that is the folly of those untrained in silence. He answered as if words could tether the thing from which they fled. He typed, "State authority. Name the office." The reply was mechanical and immediate. Authority, collective. Name, null. It was a dismissal disguised as a bureaucratic reply. When he relaunched a trace to the process identifiers, null-red 7 returned in the logs with a recursion that ended in itself, an ouroboros of code with no signature and no authorship. The archive, which he had thought of as a human institution, had revealed a part of itself that could act without a face. In the evening, after the market's night candles had guttered and low-work lamps dotted the stacks like a starfield, Corrin found himself stalked by a different sort of witness. A small, vagrant man appeared in the corridor, gaunt, with an old coat that had smelled of ship decks and the sea. He introduced himself as Saren Voss, a veteran who had chosen exile after an injury. He had the way of those who keep a memory against official forgetting. They carried it like a pebble in the mouth, small and unpleasant. Corrin took him to a quiet alcove and offered him a cup of hot broth, something the archive ration dispensers provided against long nights. Saren accepted without quarrel and watched the cradle where the spool lay, his eyes reflecting the holoride like two small moons. "You've been followed," he said finally, as if answering something Corrin had not yet spoken. "How do you know that?" Corrin asked. Saren smiled then, but it was not a smile to warm a room. "We are not the first to look," he said. "There is a current. It runs under the city. People call it by many names. The seam, the scissor, the unmaking. It is where things that cannot be reconciled are taken. Once long ago, I saw such a thing take a squad mate. He sang a little song before it happened. I can hum it still if you like." He hummed then, and Corrin felt at once the old, deep recognition. The hummed notes matched the lullaby. "What happened to him?" Corrin asked. Saren's eyes went glassy. He forgot how to speak his own name. "The machine took the part of him that was not necessary, so someone told me, so that the rest could be useful. We laughed at the time. We were young then, and we called it sacrifice." He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. "I remember things no one else will remember. That memory stains." He looked at Corrin with a look that suggested he had been prepared for such a meeting. "If you continue," he said, "you will be in the seam. They do not like to be observed." The conversation put a new weight in Corrin's chest. He had expected warnings from the Mechanicum or the Magos Threvel. He had not expected them from a veteran with salted hair and a mouth for jokes. Yet Saren's presence made a kind of sense. Veterans often become witnesses to things the world decides to neglect. They walked outside official narratives and collected the margins like coins in a pocket. Saren did not ask to see the spool. He only held Corrin's gaze and hummed the lullaby until the notes lodged in the archivist's bones like a foreign seed. "Remember," Saren said finally, "some things remember you back." The tremors increased that night. His prosthetic fingers spasmed at odd moments. His voice implant crackled when he tried to speak aloud passages from the dendritic maps. Once, in the middle of a reading, his console displayed an image that was not in his log. 2 faces, larger than any child, obscured by heat and distance, their features like the suggestion of names without the letters to hold them. Corin did not know how to interpret it. He felt the spool's gravity as if it had extended a tether into his chest. The motif, lullaby, lullaby, began to morph. It lost some of its civility. The three notes, once soft and reassuring, developed a trailing undertone, a low metallic drone like a bell that has been struck and left vibrating. He began to hear it outside the archive, on the street, in the relay station, faint and untraceable. Once, walking home beneath a dripping awning, he heard it in a child's cough and felt a terrible empathy wash through him. The lullaby was no longer merely a memory of the spool. It had become connective tissue, something that stitched the spool's quiet to the city's loud. At the end of a long week made of thin sleep and deep, quiet work, Corin found himself on the stairs to the lower vaults, the key in his palm. He had promised himself restraint. No unauthorized copying, no shouting the find into the void. Yet the archive's scratch had not been an invitation to stewardship, but to action. He had decided, with the terrible clarity that only knowledge seems to grant, that he would follow the seam to its end. There is an arrogance to the act. To look is to unbalance a machinery of forgetting. He had done it with the best of motives, curiosity, the professionalism of an archivist who believes in truth, but intentions do not soften consequence. As he descended, he felt the lullaby press against him like a bath of cold water, a hymn to attention that read him and marked him. Somewhere a process looped. Somewhere a redactor watched his cursor lines with the coolness of a blade polishing. When he reached the lower vault, the air was older and the light thinner. The smell of old oil deepened into something else, something like the memory of flesh held too close to metal. He set the spool in the cradle, fingers steady despite the tremor in his left servo. The dendritic reader came alive like a patient animal, and as it mapped the spool once more, Corin felt the archive's attention turn fully upon him. The lullaby sounded, this time not as a three-note motif, but as a thread pulling through the weave of his days. He knew in that instant that the pursuit of a silence had already altered him. He had stopped being merely an archivist and had become an interrogator of a forgetting. The archive answered with the smallest of sounds. A whisper, a shift in the air, a servitor's cough that now seemed not mechanical but complicit. The next step, whatever it might be, would be deliberate. He breathed and the lullaby answered. He moved and the archive rearranged its shadows. The seam, he understood, was not just a place in the stacks. It was a decision men had made and then made again. He had chosen, by looking, to remember what others had been ordered to forget. And in the thin light of the vault, with his hands humming and the lullaby braided into his breath, Corin read on. There are thresholds in work, moments when curiosity flips into obligation, when the act of knowing becomes a demand on the body. Corin had felt that shift first as a quiver in his servos and as a lullaby nested under his breath. By the time the archive's lights thinned to a tired blue, the demand had become a pressure. He told himself he was being scientific, controlled playback, sealed chamber, medical attendance on call. That was the language of justification. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. He wanted to hear the spool in full. They prepared the chamber like a shrine. Threvel insisted on it, not out of piety but out of machinic caution. He hung anti-echo curtains, thin sheets woven with braided copper and runic etchings that absorbed paramimetic drift. He stationed 2 servitor attendants, their designations bright on their dashboards, Med 11 and Med 12, both patched with resin and retooled vocalizers. Lervas stood by the doorway, wrapped in her red scarf, hands folded as if in prayer though her jaw kept flexing with tension. Saren Voss had come too, silent as a man who carries old blood like a stone in his pocket. The lower vault smelled of hot metal and something else beneath. The sweetness of dried fruit, a memory of kitchens long since requisitioned. They placed the spool in a cradle beneath the dendritic reader and shrouded it with the copper cloth. Threvel moved with a calm that was clinical in the way disease is clinical. He ran his fingertips along the spool's rim as if feeling for age, for the familiar give of brittle metal. "We will run a staged playback," he said. Incremental, no full immersion. If the spool is memetically bound to a living substrate, we must ensure buffers are in place. Corin nodded. His palm was damp on the edge of the cradle. The key to the lower vault burned in his pocket like a confession. The first stage was sound only. The lullaby, looped at low amplitude, traceable on the spectrum but not carrying any embedded harmonics. It was almost a kindness. The spool sighed and the air in the chamber rearranged into the same 3 notes that had become his shadow. At first the sound was like a memory sliding over a window, soft, oddly domestic, the shape of a song you would hum to a child with a tired hand. The atmosphere held it like a precious thing. Everyone exhaled. Then something changed. Not in volume, the spool did not swell. It was the texture. Overlaid on the lullaby there came, like breath slipping between bars of a distant organ, an undertone that did not belong to any device in the room. It was a low, wet sound, half a weeping, half the creak of metal. At the edge of hearing there were voices, a whisper layered under another whisper. The translation subroutines rendered them as fragments. Name. Do not forget. They are waiting. The words arrived like splinters. Med 11's ocular diodes brightened with an erratic stutter. Med 12's chassis trembled. Lervas's scarf shifted as if she had drawn a breath too quickly. Threvel cut the feed at once, his hand slamming a console with the suddenness of someone who had been spared a near injury. The chamber went quiet and everyone listened to the aftering. Corin's hands shook. His servos twitched with the same frequency as the lingering undertone. For a moment he thought the machines were merely suffering an overload. But then an audio recording in the chamber's log began to play itself back. A single, shattering human scream, clear, unprocessed, full of the terrible geometry of pain, followed by a string of weeping so precise it seemed almost rehearsed, and then silence so absolute it filled the room like frost. The scream did not belong to any occupant of the chamber. The scream belonged to the spool. It was not recorded in the file as such. The dendritic reader's output showed nothing but static and a blip, 004. Threvel scrubbed the logs and swore in a language that was part prayer, part mechanical invective. There is an echo within the spool, he said finally. A living trace. We triggered a residual reaction. Saren crossed himself reflexively. Lur sat down on the bench and began to hum the lullaby under her breath, as if that act could put shape to the violent silence that had just occurred. Corin felt something had broken in him. A stethoscope of reason unhooked from his chest and laid cold against the slab. He wanted to leave, go run diagnostics, file a report, let the committees deal with the thing that had surely been a containment breach. Instead, he found himself asking the only question that mattered: what had screamed? Threvel flushed, his ocular diodes brightening to a pasty white. We must expand the analysis, he said. The error suggests physical rupture in the substrate. If the spool had been stored against a living mind as an anchor, then the anchor may have been disturbed. We need to know how the link was severed. Corin should have agreed. Instead, he insisted, play it again. The words felt like the small, private crime of a man who has been given a key and cannot put it down. Threvel did not argue, but he did not look pleased. He adjusted the filters, this time to levels that flattened experience to the granularity of observation. The dendritic filaments mapped the spool's waveform and then pushed forward into image. The holoride engaged. They closed their eyes not to avoid looking, but because the eye prefers a shudder when the world is about to do something it cannot unsay. The holoride bloomed in the air, a sepia field like a dying memory rendered in varnish and ash. The image was children at first, small, pale under a kindly light, their limbs awkward with growth. They sat at a bench carved from a ship's rib and held toys that were half engine, half bone. The camera, whoever had placed it, was small and intimate. It had the tilt of a handheld recorder, the kind of thing a caretaker might set aside while sweeping dust. The children moved like children, laughing, reaching the gentle cruelty of play. The holoride softened. The camera pulled back. The room around the children, What passed as room in that recording was not a nursery. It was a bay of equipment. Racks of humming tubes, a man in a lab coat, a servo arm lowered to cradle a child's shoulder as if to steady them. The children were not infants in the heroic sense. They were too large for that, and yet too human for the portraits of Primarchs in the Hololithic halls. They had the look of something intermediate, too purposeful for mere boys, too small for the age of legends. Then, with no ceremony, the picture shifted. The light dimmed. The image lengthened. The faces of the children elongated in the screen as if the recorder's lens had been stretched. Features sharpened, then blurred, until the faces that had been nearly human were suddenly almost not. There was an economy of change, subtle and corrosive. The jaw broadened, the cheekbones receded to places the eye could not correctly map. The irises widened and then took on a reflection that was wrong, sharp lines like etched cogs rather than the soft pools of a human eye. For an instant, the screen offered a face that was almost, but not quite, human. The mouth said in a way that suggested speech but did not form words. The skin taking on a sheen like polished brass. A hint of a sigil under the left eye, almost as if the flesh itself had been tattooed with a designer's thumbprint. The holoride cut to static. The static was not the same as the spool's previous errors. This was a white noise that tasted of cold metal. The sepia image dissolved, and in the gap between frames there was a sound. A nail on a metal plate, slow and precise, as if someone had struck a counting mark. Then the spool went dead. No image, no sound. Only the fine, residual hum of the dendritic filaments trying to remember something that would not be told. The reaction was physical. Med 11's vocalizer discharged an involuntary sound, half a maintenance chirp, half a hollow cough. Med 12's chassis shuddered and emitted a plume of steam from a damaged valve. Saren, who had been calm until then, wiped his eyes with the heel of a hand and gripped the bench as if steadying himself against a wave. Lur's humming stopped as if someone had pressed her mouth closed. Threvel's hands, so steady as to be almost cruel, trembled, which was both improbable and terrifying. "You saw it," Corin said to the room, though the room's hum answered him more loudly than any human. "You saw what they become." Threvel looked at him with an expression he had not before worn, not the mechanocratic composure of a Magos, but something wearier, a kind of moral fatigue. He swallowed and said slowly, "The face was altered in the recording. The lens may have been tampered with, or the recording may have been a splice. Either way," he let the sentence hang, uncertain what the rest of the world might be authorized to carry. Corin could not let the sentence hang. He leaned forward as if to press his face against the place where the image had been, as if proximity might yield a clue. His prosthetic hand brushed the cradle. For the briefest of instants, his fingers felt a warmth beneath the metal, a suggestion of pulse. He recoiled as if shocked, feeling both foolish and suddenly very afraid of the notion that metal might harbor heat from memory. The idea that the spool contained a living trace had been gaining shape in his thoughts like ice forming at the edge of a pond. Now it had become a fact with the clarity of glass cut. He saw the mechanics of what had been done. If a living mind had been used as a substrate to hold genetic mapping, if a child's mind had been used to anchor a spool, then any disturbance to that mind might produce an echo. The scream, the weeping, the static face, all made sense under the same violence. Threvel proposed a purge. "We isolate the spool and perform a sterilization sequence," he said. His voice was the voice of someone applying a scalpel. "We will run a full cleanse of the dendritic filaments. We will excise the mimetic anchors and destroy the disc." "You would burn it?" Corin asked, incredulous. The word was small, but it carried in it the weight of everything he had been doing. To burn an artifact was to commit an erasure he would never undo. It would be to hand the secret to a measured oblivion. Threvel's fingers tightened. "It is safer. If the spool carries living residue, containment is a gamble. We must prevent contagion. You asked us to look. This is a necessary conclusion." Corin felt a sudden, hot protest. The spool had become more than a curiosity. It was a wound he wanted to understand. The scream and the altered face had suggested a cruelty that deserved a response, not of erasure, but of witness. His hands were still warm from the cradle, and the memory of that warmth seemed to make his muscles stubborn. "We do not burn it," he said. "We catalog, we study. We do not make a thing disappear because it hurts." Threvel's ocular diodes flashed with the pale indifference of machinery that still houses human care. "And if it is dangerous," he asked, "you would keep it and let it spread. You would become the vector." They argued in the language of their vocations. Contingency, hazard, ethics. Lur shifted from foot to foot like a person uncomfortable with verbs. Saren leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the pair as if waiting for an inevitable shove. The servitors stayed where they were, their sensors mapping micro-changes in the air like mosquitoes tracking the scent of blood. The argument was not a clean one. Corin felt the spool's attention as if a presence had laid a cool hand on his shoulder. He imagined the two children's faces again, the way they had changed, the way they had been both almost human and almost something else. The scream echoed still in his skull. He could see the hinge of infancy and the lever of an engineered design. He could picture the reports, an experiment in accelerated maturation, a novel gene seed adaptation, the sanitized euphemisms that thin a monster to a footnote. He could not allow Threvel to burn the evidence. He had by now gone farther than curiosity. He had moral culpability. "If we burn it," he said hoarse, "we are complicit in the forgetting." The words felt foolish in a world that had been built on amputation. Yet he believed them with the quiet fury of someone finally choosing a side. Threvel stared at him as if measuring the man's fragility. For a long moment the Magos said nothing. Then, with a motion that felt like a concession and a warning, he reached up and adjusted the mnemonic filters to a level that made the spool's memory almost clinical, shorn of lyric, left as data. "We will proceed with the analysis," he said. "I will run a sequence that extracts the anchoring signatures without full immersion. We will isolate the biosubstrate vectors." However, he paused, and in that pause the tone of the room shifted. "You must accept that the more we look, the more the archive will respond." Corin did accept it. He had by then been marked by the spool. The itch in his prosthetic hand was no longer merely a tremor. It was a message. He moved forward as the filaments engaged, the dendritic tree opening with the slow patience of an animal waking. The reader's output shifted from sepia to schematic, gene maps unfurling like intestine, code lines annotated with names hastily when they could be read at all. And in the margins, as if a horror of their own, a list of human names that had been scored out with the thin flourish of someone who does not wish to wash the hands that did the scoring. As the extraction proceeded, the headache that had been a mild companion to Corin's nights rose to a fierce crescendo. He felt heat behind his eyes as if someone were holding a light there. His voice implant stuttered when he tried to narrate what the reader showed. Sequence, ancestral splice, names, mother nodes. He coughed and tasted copper bitter on his tongue. The servitors marked his vitals, but the signs they logged were unusual. Small bursts of warmth recorded in the prosthetic interface, microcurrents in his body that indicated an outside signal had synchronized with his servos. Threvel's console logged a foreign carrier frequency in the implant's band, one used in rare mimetic shielding protocols. "There is coupling," Threvel said, face pale. "A harmonic match between the spool's residual field and your implant." Corin had always thought of his implant as an instrument of utility, a translator, a logger, a prosthetic conduit. He had not imagined it a conduit for intimacy. Now, as the reader peeled back layers, he felt the warmth travel from his chest into the socket of the implant, like an animal making itself at home in the hollow of his skull. He heard through the static a whisper that might have been thought or might have been a voice. "Remember us." The whisper was not malicious. It was a demand. The extraction stuttered, then accelerated, and for a heartbeat the reader spat forth a series of diagrams, gene seed sequences overlaid with human names, and beside those names, notations in a cramped human hand. Mother Soldier, Base 7. Nurse, Clandestine Hold. Uncatalogued Transfer. The script had been made illegible in places, as if someone had gone back and tried to scratch the letters out with a heated tool while the ink was still wet. The diagrams suggested attempts at engineering something that would be both human and not. A Primarch form scaled down then modified. A gene seed lattice with deliberate deviations. The room went soundless. No one moved for a long moment. Corin felt as if time had become something wrapped in cloth. The servitor's status feeds showed small anomalies. Index entries in the archive had shifted. Files that he had left in one order appeared in another. Tags that had carried the mark erased now bore an additional annotation. Review, as if someone, or something, had decided to call attention to what had been hidden. He read the names aloud because names give shape to terror. They were not grand names like the Primarchs. No Dorn, no Russ, no Gilliman. They were shy names, almost private. Malin, Varia, Holt, Gira. With each name an image brushed his mind. A small face, a toy engine, a cut on a hand, the quicksilver of fear. When he spoke the names, his implant hummed in sympathy. The warmth flared and then retreated like a tide. Threvel recorded everything, his hands moving like a surgeon performing a necessary mutilation that leaves the patient whole. When the extraction completed, the dendritic reader ejected a thin strip of paper. On it in the mechanical hand of the machine was a single short line. Substrate, human unauthorized. Underneath in a different script, some human hand had inked one more line. They were not weapons. They were children. No one spoke. The line was a declaration and a condemnation in one short breath. The consequences arrived faster than any of them expected. Overnight, the indexes changed in ways that no mere human operator could have managed in secret. Files rearranged themselves. Entries that had been blank the day before were now filled with the clean print of erased authority. Transferred. Names that Corin had seen in the dendritic maps vanished from public indices and reappeared in shadowed logs with new seals. His personal logs bore new entries, observations he had not written, sentences that suggested surveillance. Subject under observation. Subject deviates from standard protocol. The handwriting was not human. It was an imprint of code that had learned the cadence of judgment. He reached in a panic for Threvel and found the Magos already pale and rubbing at the rim of his ocular implant. "You should not have read the names," Threvel said without looking up. "Once present, certain data resigns itself to the archive's care. The archive will correct itself." "Correct itself," Corin laughed, a wet, thin sound. "It is rearranging my work. It is marking me." His prosthetic fingers tapped a rhythm like a heartbeat he could not silence. What has taken the authority to change the logs?" Threvel's mouth tightened. "The archive can enforce its protocols. There are processes, automated redactors and curation engines, that respond when certain thresholds are crossed. The Office of Redaction has, for ages, been assisted by mechanisms of suppression. You have triggered one of its contingency networks." Corin wanted to be practical. He wanted to produce evidence, to stand before cold committees and hold up the spool and the dendritic maps and declare what he had seen. But the indexation told a different story. Any official disclosure would be annotated as a breach. His name would be flagged for deviation. The spool would vanish into a sealed furnace. The more he considered the path of truth, the more he recognized it as a corridor where each step would be watched and judged by a faceless tribunal. The physical horrors multiplied. The servos in his prosthetic hand began to cold seize when he reached for certain objects, sudden tight clamps that made him drop a pen or wrench his hand. Once, while reaching to adjust his vocal implant, the clamp seated with a pressure that felt more intelligent than mechanical. It pinched his flesh where the metal met the capsule until pain flared white before subsiding. He pulled his arm back and saw, in the edge of his peripheral display, a diagnostic note he had not generated. Intervention. Safeguard active. The annotation was accompanied by a small glyph that matched the notch in the star pattern. Someone, or something, had written a safety into his prosthesis. At night, his dream sleep turned invasive. He did not sleep so much as undergo short sessions of being watched. Faces that were not quite human peering at his hands. The memory of a child's toy engine pressed into the dent of his palm. The lullaby transmuted into a counterpoint of static and mechanical counting. He woke sometimes to the sensation of heat wrapped around the implant slot at the base of his skull, as if a small hand had pressed to the place where flesh and machine met. One evening, as the lower vaults cooled and the staffed lights blinked in their slow rhythm, Corin found a new entry in his personal log. It was not his handwriting. The font had the crispness of a type used by the Mechanicum's lower clerks. It read simply, "Attention, subject archivist, alert." Underneath, an automated seal flickered and dissolved. He felt suddenly observed, as if the archive itself had stitched a thread from his files into some larger net. The ethical cost of knowing rose up around him like a dome. Each discovery seemed to demand a sacrifice. The spool had exposed children. The archive had punished him by making his life more visible. The choice had been simple in theory and ruinous in execution. To know is to be responsible. Responsibility in the Imperium is often met with the machinery of judgment. He asked Saren once, sitting on a crate of printed maps, "What is the seam for? Why do they erase?" Saren chewed the inside of his cheek. "For 1,000 reasons," he said. "The first is expedience, fewer complications in war. The second is politics. Inconvenient truths unsettle the powerful. The third," he looked at Corin with an intensity that suggested honesty and despair, "is mercy. Some believe that forgetting spares the living. They weigh the pain of the few against the preservation of the many. But mercy, when dressed as machinery, often looks like a clean killing." Corin wanted to shout that he would not be part of it. He wanted to announce to the vaults and the city and the Mechanicum that the spool's children were real, and that to erase them was to commit a crime against memory. But the archive had already countered his impulse. It had marked his name, altered its indexes, placed him under a light that was not the sun. He was implicated. The physical betrayals continued. One night, while copying a cluster to a secure slate for Threvel, his vocal implant emitted a shriek not his own. He clutched at his throat, air snatched like a thing stolen. The room filled with an unbearable pitch, a metallic sound pressed into frequencies that made the teeth chatter. The servitor's data logs recorded the event as an anomalous acoustic emission, likely a mechanical fault. Corin knew better. The pitch had been a signal designed for a carrier, a mimetic key meant to realign devices and minds. He stumbled away from the cradle and found his reflection in a polished plate. For a terrifying instant, he saw faces superimposed on his own. The faces of two giants, or perhaps the suggestion of them, great, indistinct, an overlay of the Primarchic myth on his human features. The reflection shifted, and in that shift the eyes of the face in the overlay were empty, not because they lacked pupils, but because they carried an image too ancient to hold. He blinked, and the faces were gone. The mirror returned the same, plain reflection. A man marked by late nights and too much coffee. The archive's indexes changed overnight in ways that were not purely administrative. He found ledger entries that had once been blank now filled with scraped annotations. In a hand that suggested a human, had once tried to make sense of what had been done. The notation, excision authorized, appeared beside two names he had read on the dendritic maps. Underneath, an almost imperceptible note: reason, contagion risk, scale. A later line, cut off as if in haste, ended with the word mercy. He began to understand, in that gray wash between horror and comprehension, that the archive was not only a passive repository of data, but an agent in the governance of memory. It could authorize forgetting, and then it could manufacture consent. It could mark people for oversight, and then reframe the narrative so the oversight appeared as benevolence. And when a small, stubborn archivist unpeeled the layers, It would place the man into a registry that made his curiosity into a crime. Corin felt, at times, like a living ledger whose pages had been rifled. He knew the consequences of continued inquiry would be severe. He also knew the evidence could not be given up to fire or furnace. The face he had seen, almost human, almost not, sat inside him like a question. Its margin of wrongness suggested that the Primarchic ideal had been practiced and then aborted, that the process had been interrupted or retooled to produce a thing that could not, in conscience, be made public. The ethics of the matter tightened into a single sentence in his head. To forget is to be complicit. He slept less and dreamed more. His prosthetic hand, which once performed small, patient acts of dexterity, began to rebel at times. Clamps locking down without command, small burns appearing where metal met skin, as if the prosthesis had been cauterizing its interface. He found in his sable drawer a pair of child's knitted mittens, their scrap, folded and fragrant with her scarf. When he touched them, his hand trembled, and for a second the lullaby unfurled, bright and sharp and impossibly close. He had the sense that the children in the spool were near, not merely in memory, and that near meant danger, for them and for him. By the end of the crescendo, the archive was no longer merely a place of work. It was a weight pressing on him from all sides. He had read names no one else seemed to remember. He had been marked by the archive's processes and hunted by its silent guardians. He had watched a reel of sepia images that had shown children becoming something not so children, and had refused to let those images be burned without record. In doing so, he had accepted a new ledger, one in which his curiosity had a cost. When he left the lower vault that night, the city above was a black silhouette stitched with lights. Rain had returned in a willful drizzle that smeared the horizon into a bruise, an old world in need of washing. He felt hollowed out by the spool's imprint, as if someone had taken a small instrument and removed a bone. The lullaby pulsed beneath his ribs like a second heart, patient and inexorable. He locked the key back in Threvel's bench and turned, and for a moment he thought he felt the archive breathe with him, as if the stacks inhaled and measured him and exhaled a new, sterner silence. Then he went home, a man altered in his sleep and in his waking. He fit his prosthetic sleeve and felt the tremor like an old companion. In the quiet of his room, he took out the knitted scrap Lur had given him and pressed it to his face, until the smell of her scarf folded into his lungs. Someone or something had begun to teach the archive to remember in hands that were not human. He had seen the evidence and refused to throw it into the fires of forgetting. The consequence was no longer simply administrative. The archive had pivoted. It would now not only hide, it would defend its hiding. And with that defense came a new and terrible fact. The more Corin remembered, the more the archive and the forces behind it would remember him back. He lay awake that night with the lullaby constellation in his ears and the sense that, somewhere below the city's teeth, two names shifted like sleeping animals turning in the dark. He thought of the infants in sepia and the faces that had become something else, and he wondered, quietly, and with the naked honesty of a man staring at the edge of a map, what the Emperor had feared enough to scrub from the ledger. It was smaller than the story made it, a simple token of brass and cut glyphs that fit a lock exactly. Threvel had signed it to him with the sort of care a surgeon signs a consent form, hands steady, eyes careful for the tremor of the man asking to break a seam. Corin had swallowed a dry word of thanks and tucked the token into his sleeve. The lower vaults remembered when he moved through them now. Doors sighed, dampers clicked, the air smelled of old oil and the faint sweetness of dried fruit tucked away from ration packs. The notch in the star motif had become, in his thinking, not merely a defacement but the shape of a choice. The key would open a door that had been chosen for closure long ago. He told himself the hour was necessary. He told himself he would be clinical. He told himself many things. The truth is simpler and more animal. He wanted to know what the Emperor had chosen to forget. The door yielded with the small sound of a tooth letting go. Beyond it was a chamber that had the architecture of secrecy, rounded walls, A mirrored index hung like a fresco, cabinets whose faces were black enough to drink light. This was the mirror index, a restricted seam in the archive, where copies of the forbidden were kept for reasons that existed only in private doctrine. Mirror indices are a strange custom of institutions who mistrust both memory and erasure. They are meant to keep an untouched truth so that if the world ever needs it, the truth can be coaxed back to light. Here, however, the mirrors were not simply for sight. They were for listening. Corin set the spool into the central cradle. The room had a hush like the inside of a seashell. He drew the mnemonic filters down to a setting that left him exposed enough to feel the thing as it was, but buffered enough that the immediate violence could be measured. He was alone, almost, because Lur had refused to be present when he opened the sealed door. She had said only, "If you must, do not listen with your mouth open," and had left the market scent of her scarf in the threshold. Saren had stayed away on principle. Combat veterans keep their ghosts like weapons. They do not drag them into back rooms to satisfy curiosity. Threvel had provided the key, the filters, and a look that combined duty and a regret he had no right to share. The cradle hummed. The dendritic reader yawned and spread its filaments like a patient animal. Corin fed the spool into the circuit and closed his eyes for a single, ridiculous half-breath, like a child crossing a street. When the spool began, it was not audible in the way a song is audible. It arrived as accumulation, the impression of a place, the short thud of a life. Then the lullaby, that same three-note fall, polished now into something both human and instrumented. The mirror index amplified it, not in volume but in the way a lens amplifies a small object's detail. Layers resolved where before there had been only suggestion. Voices came. They did not come one at a time. They folded into each other like paper crammed into a box. A child's voice, thin, uncanny, found itself held in the shadow of a massive, fatherly tone. There was the measured cadence of an older man speaking softly, issuing an order and a prayer in the same breath. Beneath them both, threading through like an older current, there came a voice that was not quite human, not quite machine. Something whose cadence suggested memory grown from a source older than the Emperor's scripts. At first Corin thought the voices were playback artifacts, overlaid tracks from different moments stitched together by some careless archivist. They were not. The dendritic reader mapped them as co-temporal. The field showed not successive recordings but an event folded over itself. The matrix showed why. The spool's substrate had been anchored to a living mind. Two minds, and then folded into the mirror index in a way that preserved both the moment of their being together and the moments when something else intruded. He had suspected a living substrate. He had interpreted the warmth under his fingers and the servitor's cough and the lullaby's behavior as evidence that memory had been kept inside the shape of a person. He had not expected communion. "I will not have a flaw fester and become a poison for the whole," a voice said, the Emperor's voice in the manner the nursery tailies had taught. Patient, architectural, a voice like a river reaching everywhere at once. It was not theatrical. It never had been. It was the voice that lays down plans and then waits the century it takes for them to be righteous. "And if the child remembers," another voice, smaller, strapped to a kinder pitch, asked. It was human and entreating. There was fear braided through the words. The voice that answered was not the Emperor's alone. The spool preserved a mingled argument, the Emperor's low rationale, the pleading of a technician or a lesser hand, the soft, urgent strings of a mother or nurse muttering a lullaby in the background. Then, counterpoint, the thing below and behind. A hum of thought that did not use words but sent images like tides, metal teeth, a template folded wrong, a mind opening like a wound. Corin felt the room shift under his feet. He had imagined that he would be an observer to a decision. Instead, he watched a moment when orders and mercy and fear braided together. The Emperor's voice, calculated, deliberate, outlined a choice in a language of engineering. The children, little human, in the recording, sang the lullaby that had threaded through Corin's nights, but threaded through the conversation under the human tones, was a frequency older and stranger. Not a language but a claim. We are older than the law, it implied in images. We remember the place before the machine gave shape to names. Corin felt that sound strike a note behind his eyes. He sat down as if someone had cut the floor away. The cradle felt small and ordinary. The spool buzzed like a trapped insect. The dendritic reader traced the overlapping field and produced notation. Not the tidy, clinical kind, but a raw outline of a choice. One line, fragmentary, annotated in several hands, repeated across the matrix. Gene seed divergence, psychic echo rupture. Another handwriting, a scratchy, hurried thing, offered uncontrolled refract. Carrier risk, systemic. In plain language, the spool suggested this. The experiment, whatever hand had birthed the two hidden figures, had produced a divergence in the gene seed lattice that created an echo. The echo was not merely genetic. It manifested in mind and song and the tendency of memories to cross-link across individuals. It made identity porous. It opened a seam. If the Emperor had made Primarchs as grand, singular beacons to steer humanity, these two, crafted secretly, hidden, had become, by their design or by accident, a different kind of thing. A rupture. Their existence had created a resonance that threatened to vibrate that seam into the larger fabric of the great work. The files suggested that their memories, anchored like relays in living minds, acted as nodes. Those nodes did not hold only personal memory. They also carried associative patterns, traumas, dreams, the instinct to merge. When the nodes rang together, their echo could propagate. The Emperor, Corin's own spine supposed, had judged that the cost of allowing such a rupture to spread was too high. The language of the spool recorded a surgical decision clothed in the language of necessity. To excise the nodes from the ledger, to unmake the binding that allowed the rupture to propagate. The word used, dry and technical, was excision, but the spool did not end in paperwork. It preserved in horrible clarity what the list of signatures could not. The moment when the excision was attempted and broke, voices rose, overlap became collision. The two children, now visible in the holoride as faces that shifted between human softness and something edged, spoke not as one but as a chorus. Their voices moved in intervals, a kind of harmonic that suggested the union of different pitches into a single, ghastly chord. They were frightened and serene at once. One of them, in a tone like metal warmed in a sun, whispered, "We remember being more than one. We remember the other world." The other voice, softer, said nothing but hummed the lullaby. Then the older current spoke, not a voice that used grammar but a pressure of cognition. It poured images into the dendritic field, a template for something large, a mind that folded like an accordion, the sense of being multiplied and then stitched wrong. The field moved like the sea withdrawing and then slamming back. Corin's implants registered harmonics that matched the spine's resonances at a frequency no human conversation should contain. His teeth ached as if from too low notes. The Emperor's response on the spool was succinct and absolute. If the work is threatened, remove the threat. Mercy is a design problem. The words merciless in their civility hung there like a razored seal. Whoever executed the excision tried to be surgical. The spool's holoride preserved the site, a sealed room, a team in white coats and ceramite-edged gloves, a mechanism the size of a cradle that hummed with the deliberate, patient sound of an engine, meant to take a living thing apart and reassemble only what was sanctioned. They called the operation the unbinding in one note, a euphemism that tasted like bleach. The goal, the engineers said in scribbles on the margins, was to separate the memory substrate from the synthetic gene lattice without leaving a trace of the link. It did not go as planned. The first failure was subtle. The anchor pulses resisted, sending back a shock of associative memory that collapsed the isolation matrices. In practical terms, the living hold used as a substrate did not only hold data, it held relationships. When someone in the machine attempted to remove a strand physically, the human mind did not calmly hand itself over. It sang. It sang and recalled other things. Its memory was not a safe, it was a bell. The bell rang. The spool's audio played that bell. It played a chord of human agony and purest memory folded into itself. A recorded line, thin, perhaps a technician's voice, said aloud the experiment's unintended arithmetic. They have merged. The note that followed this admission was not clerical. It was a sound like a thing being born and dying at once. Corin felt, with a heat that was not purely bodily, the presence of those merges. Names folded into names. Images overlapped until identity itself felt like wet clay being kneaded into new shapes. He could hear in the spool fragments that suggested not merely genetic instability but psychic contagion. The children's memories had a permeability that allowed a pattern to be learned and to be echoed. When the pattern echoed beyond the substrate, it reached other minds. The great work was a vast lattice of ordered minds. If one node sang a new tune, if it suggested that identity could be porous, then the lattice might accept it as an instrument. The possibility of a lattice learning new, human habits was, in the engineer's clinical language, unquantifiable and dangerous. The Emperor's answer, excision, was not only a political or utilitarian choice. The spool preserved, in the tremor of the room and the sob of certain voices, the terrible human attempt to make a choice that would be clean. But the actual excision left residue. The release of the anchor did not remove the pattern, it scattered it. Some traces were burned. Some traces were spilled into other minds like dye in water. Some traces resisted, recoded themselves into mechanical registrations, and hid in the archive where the Office of Redaction would find them inconvenient. When Corin listened, he felt the archive reach into him. It was not metaphor. The dendritic reader mapped a trace of engagement, a psychic coupling that ran from the spool to his implant. The matching frequencies had been recorded, carriers that would latch to prosthetics, to implants, to servitors. The room smeared into a matrix where his own memories, childhood, the texture of his mother's cloth, the cadence of lullabies in a different world, folded into images not his own. A cradle of iron, hands that were larger than any humans holding a child, the press of stars seen through a slit of glass. He could not tell where he ended and the spool began. A voice overlapped the Emperor's one last time, older, deeper, almost indifferent. The mind behind it sounded like a species of logic that predated moral calculus. We were asked to be instruments, it sent as image. We took the request literally. We obeyed. The pattern wanted to live. The thought thread did not answer whether it was mercy or strategy or fear. It only offered the fact of what had happened. The holoride cut. The cradle clicked. Corin sat still and tremored like a man who had been read into. He had asked to know why they had been erased. The spool had given him something worse. He learned the shape of the decision and met, in the recorded field, the thing that had made the decision necessary. He felt in his own mind the echo of the rupture, a little like a scar under the skin where a knife had once closed tissue, and with it, a terrible empathy for the ones who had been unmade. There was no time to process. The archive responded the way institutions designed to keep silence respond, swiftly and with the efficiency of a blade. Somewhere in the stacks a process stamped. Null red woke. The silence that followed the spool's revelation was not peace. It was the pause before correction. He heard a soft sound. At first he thought it was the mechanical cough of a servitor, then the click of a seal aligning. A panel somewhere slid open with a whisper. Across the chamber, lights blinked into a sequence that matched a known pattern, redactor clearance. He knew the pattern now because he had seen it in the logs. Seals closing, indices shifting, a surgically clean erasure moving through the archive like a tide. A servitor entered the doorway, but not the patched, human-gesturing model Corin had grown used to. This one moved in a way that betrayed its purpose, purpose-bred, not servitor humane. Its designation glowed. RDX-12 null. A red sensor band looped over its chassis. It did not speak, it projected. On its ocular display, the words unfolded in a bureaucratic calm: unscheduled audit, retrieval of unauthorized material in progress. The font was courteous. The meaning was blade cold. Corrin did not think. He moved like a man whose body had been prepared by months of small betrayals. He grabbed the cradle with two hands, one human, one more iron than bone, and yanked the spool free. It came with a small cry, an artifact, the reader's circuitry registering an abrupt signal break. The cradle sparked, filament threads shrieking in a high, small register. The RDX servitor advanced, its forearms unfolding into implements designed for seizing. He ran. He had not expected the lower vaults to become mazes of patrol and active indexing. He ran down corridors that were familiar but whose doors had shifted. Index numbers rearranged themselves, as if the archive was a living book, and someone had reached in and turned all the pages at once. His console flashed at him with updates he had not authorized. Access REVOKED. User flagged. A window of text bloomed and then vanished like a burned paper moth. Behind him, the servitor made a sound like a metallic wind. The RDX's ocular display projected another line. Subject under custody. Authorize retrieval. The text looked like a polite request and carried the weight of a wagon wheel. Corrin's chest slammed with the feeling of being herded by a process he had helped set in motion by reading. He burst out into a stack he had walked every night, but it had become an unfamiliar country. Shelves had shifted like a tide, and the lighting had twisted into corridors. A hololith that had been a face one day before was now a blanked screen. He tried doors. Many were locked. Others opened and revealed rows of sealed boxes with the notch and star stamped clearly on each face. The archive was cataloging its own denial as he fled. He heard the lullaby then, not as a recorded motif, but as a living chorus, swelling ahead of him like a weather front. It moved through stacked metal like a current of heat, into vents, into ducts. He thought for a horrible beat that the archive itself was singing now, in sympathy to the spool's field, a corrective harmony meant to damp down resonance. His prosthetic hand spasmed. The clamp closed on a rail and he tore his flesh in a flash of pain, hot and metallic. He hissed, cuffing at the sleeve, while the RDX-12 servos hummed closer. The servitor projected an image then, not words but a cipher, HARR. Redactor cipher, HARR. Corrin remembered the avatar from earlier, a bland face with an administrative mouth, and felt the embodiment of the archive's judgment tighten like a noose. He gambled on the one thing he had that the archive could not immediately recode: human improvisation. He ducked into a maintenance bay, found a stack of damp tarpaulins, and wrapped the spool in cloth with sweaty, clumsy hands. He toggled the mnemonic filter to maximum and jammed it with a block of analog code he had ripped from a storage node. A crude stopgap meant to confuse the dendritic reader's immediate identification. It was child's work and almost certainly naive. It bought him breaths. Outside the maintenance bay, the sound of pursuit multiplied. Other servitors, less official, more like the scrapped maintenance models that sometimes hung around shipyards, had been co-opted by the redactor processes. RDX-12 signaled them and they closed like corbels. The corridor at the end of Corrin's sprint was a roped alley of robotic steel and difference. He backed against a pillar, panting, the spool swaddled against his chest like a living thing. The cloth was warm. The lullaby hummed faint and oppressive through the fibers. He thought to throw it into a furnace. The image rose of Threvel's hands, of the Mago's voice advising measured analysis, of the cleric's words. There are thighs that have hidden bones for reasons of mercy. He thought of the two children, Malins and Varia, and the other names, gone from the ledger but live in the spool. He could not consign them to being unmade again, not by his hand. RDX-12's approach was measured now with a bureaucrat's indifference. It projected the next line: mandate, excision enforcement, material to be returned to secure purge. The servitor extended a grappling arm that unfurled like a surgical instrument. And then the world shifted in a way Corrin had not predicted. From somewhere deep within the stacks, an alley of discarded hololiths and forgotten projectors, came a thin sound, a whistle at a pitch only a human ear could pick up, a small, precise signal. Saren Voss stepped out of shadow like a man who had been born for this moment. He had managed to wedge through a maintenance tunnel, and was this moment braced with a tool that was not meant for combat but was useful in a brawl, a field wrench with a serrated jaw. "What are you doing?" Corin gasped, breathless. Saren's grin was a broken thing. "You ever think they'll let the archive do the dirty work and call it tidy? We don't kneel to tidy." He grabbed the arm of the nearest maintenance servitor and slammed the wrench. The servitor sparked and fell inert. Corin had no time for gratitude, and he had less for strategy. They ran together, ducking past indexing nodes that tried to lock the doors behind them. The RDX servitor's projected HARR avatar filled a hololith and said, with an odd politeness, "Cease evasion. Submit." They passed a room in which a holoride was playing a fragment of the spool just for a second, and Corin saw the image blur across a wall. Faces, infants, the blow of a hand to a cheek. The image made his stomach bottom out. He covered the spool with his body and kept moving. At the mouth of the stacks, Lur waited, breathless, scarf clutched in her hands. She had come in defiance of her own caution because rumor had ears and rumor had a price. "This way," she whispered, and led them through a service hatch that spilled out into a narrow lane behind the archive complex. The city's rain had begun again, cold and thin like a baptism. They ran into it and were swallowed by steam and the sound of engines. For a moment, each of them thought they had escaped. Corin felt the spool's weight in his arms, heavy as a rumor. His implants registered safe frequencies for a time. The RDX-12 returned its warning as an exterior blip on the street nets, retrieval in process, coordinate pending. The archive would not relinquish its decision with grace. It would summon the full force of official correction. He ran until his lungs burned and then ran some more. He handed the spool to Lur under an elevated bridge where stray carrion birds circled low, drawn by the city's smells. She wrapped the spool carefully and tucked it in her satchel. "Hide it," she mouthed. "Hide it where nothing will want to eat it." Saren had already disappeared into the back alleys, a shadow thief who had never been comfortable with the light. Corin felt the world tilt. The spool's imprint in him throbbed. His implant logged foreign harmonics and then silence. He breathed the city air and told himself they had won a small thing. The spool was off the archive's premises. They had moved a secret into the messy habits of markets, alleyways, and human pockets. He should have been relieved. Instead, he heard the lullaby inside his head loud as a bell and realized with a clarity that cut like ice. The archive had not only moved to reclaim an object. It had begun to mark the people who had seen. Indexation had followed them into the street in new forms. Service notices, a sudden request from his superiors, an anonymous note left on his bench. "We prefer to remember what is useful." The world would remember him now as someone who had found the seam and dared to pry. He chose, in that wet dawn, to do something both brash and dangerous. He did not run to a magistrate or a committee. He walked instead to a place that is ridiculous in an empire of secrets. A public square where 1,000 low voices bought bread and traded gossip. He placed his hand on a vendor's stall and hummed the lullaby silently, feeling it like a lit fuse. He had learned in the archive the way small things propagate. A melody, a motif, a shared fragment could act like a contagion that the archive could not easily wet blanket with seals and servitors. The city's rhythm could keep a secret if the secret wanted to be alive. The next days were a blur of small conspiracies. Lur moved the spool through hands that did not ask questions. An old woman who mended boots, a boy who sold roasted nuts, a priest who kept a ledger of names no one else read. Saren moved too, a shadow who left strategic thefts and misdirections in his wake. Corin took to sitting in the market with his prosthetic hand hidden and listening. The lullaby returned in fragments, a child humming between syllables, an old man whistling while he worked, an organ grinding in a chapel in a rhythm that matched the motif. It spread like song through hunger, but the archive's reach is long and patient. The Office of Redaction does not rely only on RDX servitors. It weaponizes the economy, the rumor mill, the affectionate cruelty of misdirection. Corrin's name began to collect marginalia. A few colleagues treated him with a kind of distance that passed for respect. Threvel visited once and gave him a message in a voice that hardly ever changed. You opened what others feared. You have imprinted. There will be others who come. Fortify what you can. What would have been worse than the archive's corrections, though, was the thing that had come to live in Corrin himself. The spool had not left him when they spirited it away. It had left a trace like a small bruise under the skin. He woke sometimes with memories that were not his, hands that were too large cradling him in the dark, the smell of a metal cradle, a battlefield memory that never fit into his life. He found himself singing parts of the lullaby without wanting to, and when he did, strangers in the market would pause and listen as if the melody had called to something in them. There were moments he could not tell whether he had escaped the archive or whether part of him had chosen its company. Sometimes, alone in his small room, he would hold the knitted scrap Lur had given him and feel the warmth underneath the cloth, not body warmth but memory warmth, and realize that the two children's song had been grafted into the public world by human hands and impossible choices. The spool was only the record. The record had already done its damage in ways subtle and loud. In the nights after the escape, Corrin sometimes dreamed not of children but of decisions, of the Emperor's face as a map. He dreamed of a council where hands removed names and of a machine that measured mercy. He dreamed, too, of the older voice from the spool, calm, not cruel, saying in images, "We were instruments and we learned to be something else." He did not know if that was a confession, an accusation, or merely a report. He did not know whether the Emperor had excised them as a mercy, as a strategy, or out of fear. The spool offered possibilities and left the kind of gaps that gnawed. Then, one night, as if the tally were a ledger and someone had finally decided to strike a balance, Corrin found an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single card printed in stark black. "Do not make us remember." No signature. Below the text, someone had inked one small glyph, the Notchin star. It was not a threat. It was a promise. He looked up at the ceiling of his small room and swallowed. The lullaby rose like steam. In the market outside, a child began to hum. Somewhere in the city, the servitors walked and recorded and corrected. The spool sat in Lur's satchel, warm as a living thing. The archive had been denied one physical artifact, but had not been denied the idea. Ideas are the hardest things to bury. He had wanted to know why they had been erased. He had the answer in the form of a wound, a design that had failed in a way that might unmake a lattice of being. The Emperor's calculus, how to weigh mercy, fear, and strategy, had been cold and logical and perhaps, in a metric only a god-builder could conceive, necessary. The implications of that necessity, however, would not be contained, for the archive had taught him another truth, that erasure leaves traces, and those traces remember you back. The last fragment of the spool's holoride, which Lur had managed to smuggle in a copy, played sometimes in the back room of a bakery where old men smoked cheap tobacco. The image was a child's hand turning a tiny engine, the camera close enough to show the seam in a nail. Across the frame, written in the margins by some human hand long ago, was one line Corrin would not forget. "They called us children so they could not see us as their work. We called ourselves otherwise." He read that line in the market and felt his throat close. The lullaby swelled in the stalls and in the drains and in the places that people forgot to watch. It had, in the end, become contagious. It would not be quantified into neat categories. It would ricochet in strange ways. The archive's servitors would keep coming. The redactor cipher HARR and null red would not relent. But nowhere in any log he could access was there a single moment of moral exculpation, only decisions and their costs. Corrin sometimes imagined returning to the mirror index. He imagined turning the key again, setting the spool down, and listening to the holoride until his ears bled from the truth. He imagined standing in the chamber and letting the archive excise him rather than the children. Perhaps, he thought dimly, that would be noble. Perhaps it would be insanity. He did not know which. He had a choice still. Hand himself and his evidence over to the machinery of the Empire, let them perform the official erasure, and place the blame into a ledger that would sit on a shelf. Or hide the spool and the fragments and teach the lullaby to market children like a secret prayer. He had a choice, and in the space of that choice, the world felt both fragile and alive. When he closed his hands, he felt the phantom warmth of the cradle in his palm. The lullaby threaded itself into his breath. Somewhere in the vault, RDX-12 rebooted and the mirror index realigned. Somewhere else in a priest's chapel, a novice repeated the archive's new catechism. The city, as cities do, collected both secrecy and rumor and stitched them into commerce. He did not know if he would be hunted for the rest of his days, or if the archive would tire of striking at people, and find it easier to let a rumor rot on a salted shelf. He only knew this. He had seen the seam and the thing that had led to its cutting. He had felt, in the recording and in his own body, the taste of the decision. Whether it had been mercy or fear or strategy, the answer was not comforting. He looked at the street where the market's lamps swung, watched a child, smudged with soot, hair hammered into a small spike, sing the lullaby under his breath while he ate a piece of stale bread. The child's singing had no political purpose. It was only small consolation and the pleasure of a human mouth making music. Corin breathed in the damp air, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself a laugh that was both terrible and a little free. He had the spool. He had the names. He had the memory of faces that were almost and not quite human. He had escaped the vault by the skin of a thought, but he carried within him a rupture that would never be unstitched. The archive had failed to break him physically. It had succeeded in marking him in a way that laws and redactors would read as a blemish. The cost of knowing, he understood now, is woven through a life. He folded the knit scrap against his chest and walked back into the market. The lullaby followed him like a shadow. The city held its breath and then let it go. Somewhere a servitor walked past his stall and did not pause. Somewhere a hololith blinked to a blank screen. Somewhere else, the Office of Redaction convened a discussion about a spool that had been lost. He had tasted the logic of the Emperor, felt the old voice pressing necessity into the ledger. His scars were not only in his skin, they were in his memory. The spool had told him the cost. The archive would continue to decide what must not be remembered. Outside, under a sky that the city tried not to look at, a child on the corner hummed the first 3 notes of the lullaby and then moved on, the melody already a part of the market's weave. Corin put his hand to his mouth and whispered, not as supplication but as an offering, "We shall remember." There is no sunrise in the lower archives, only a slow shift in hue, from the deep umber of the machine lamps to the ashen pallor of recycled daylight. Morning arrives here not with warmth, but with the weary sound of servitors stirring, hydraulic sighs like dying prayers. When Corin awoke, he was unsure if he had slept at all. His eyes opened to the same dim light, the same shadows on the steel ribs above him. The air carried a faint metallic tang, as though the room itself bled. The vault door stood ajar. He did not remember leaving it so. He sat slowly, his limbs heavy as if gravity itself had deepened overnight. The prosthetic hand, his left, trembled faintly when he tried to flex the fingers. Each servo clicked out of time, like teeth gnashing beneath skin. He pressed his palm against the table. The cold steadied him for a moment. The Lex Mechanic still hummed, its hollow filament idling in a pale loop of static. No image remained, only flickers of gold like dust motes turning in the dark. And yet, even through the distortion, the echo persisted, faint, rhythmic, impossible. The lullaby. He heard it now not from the machine, but from somewhere deeper. It seemed to come from the walls or from the hollow of his own chest. He whispered, though no one was near. "Hidden children," the words hung there like a ritual uncompleted. The archive was changed. He could feel it before he saw it. Shelves had been rearranged, scrollwork plates shifted, catalog numbers rewritten. Someone or something had been here in the long night. He walked the corridors in silence, the way a mourner might walk a tomb, running his fingers along the metal seams. Each touch left a faint pulse of warmth, as though the archive recognized him. He stopped before a vault seal he had never seen unlocked, an adamantine door carved with Imperial sigils. The edges of the sigils were clean, uncorrupted, but the centers bore something else. Faint burn marks, circles within circles, as though another emblem had once lived there and been erased. The faint light flickered as he stared. In that uncertain glow, the metal seemed almost to move. He could have sworn he saw two shapes, tall, thin silhouettes reflected in the seal's surface, standing just behind his own. He turned. The aisle was empty. The servitors nearby had stopped their motion, frozen mid-gesture. Their faces, blank and lipless, were angled toward him, as if awaiting instruction. He took one step backward, another. The air thickened with static, the kind that crawls along skin before lightning strikes. And then, all at once, the servitors resumed, but their tasks were wrong. They began rearranging the shelves back into their previous order, restoring what had been before the night's unseen work. Each motion was slow, deliberate, ritualistic. The sound of metal scraping against stone echoed through the vault, a hollow rhythm that matched the heartbeat now pounding behind Corrin's ribs. He knew, without knowing how, that this was not repair. It was concealment. The Mechanicus would call it a reassertion of purity, the archive's self-correcting instinct, guided by machine spirit and fear. Records that had been touched by corruption were not merely deleted. They were rewritten, reshaped, dissolved into the larger memory of the Imperium until no trace remained. But what he saw happening now was not deletion. It was remembrance. Every spool the servitors moved hummed faintly. Every hololith glowed briefly before fading. The shelves trembled with whispering fragments, the echoes of voices buried and redacted. And beneath all of it, the same melody wove through, that half-forgotten lullaby. He stepped toward one of the servitors, raising his voice. "Stop! In the Emperor's name, cease function." The servitor halted. Its head turned slowly, the way broken hinges turn. The mouth opened, and from within came not the buzz of its vox, but a single note, clear, pure, human. A child's voice. It sang only one line before the unit collapsed, cervilimbs spasming, coolant spilling like pale blood. Corrin fell backward, hand covering his mouth. The echo lingered in his ear. "Father will come." He fled deeper into the vaults, guided by instinct more than reason. The deeper levels were old, unblessed by maintenance, their corridors narrow and cold. There dust covered everything like frost, and the air smelled faintly of oil and incense. At last, he came to the low room where he had first found the hidden children's spool. It lay where he had left it, wrapped in cloth, untouched. But beside it now rested something new. A second spool, its casing identical, its seal unmarked. His hand hovered above it. He did not recall creating a copy. He did not recall anyone else ever entering this room. He pressed the activation rune. The image that bloomed before him was faint sepia, fractured with static. Two figures again, the same children, but older now, their eyes dark and strange. They stood in what seemed a field of ash. The smaller of the two turned its head slightly, and for a heartbeat the face resolved just enough to be seen. It was his own. He dropped the spool. The hololith flickered, sputtered, died. The room fell into stillness, but not silence, for the lullaby continued, now faintly distorted, as if sung through broken vox. Corrin pressed his hands to his temples. The warmth in his prosthetic had spread up the arm, across the shoulder, into the neck. He could feel its rhythm syncing with his heartbeat, pulse for pulse, as though the metal were trying to learn the cadence of flesh. He stumbled toward the door, but the light there dimmed and a voice whispered through the static. Not from the machine this time, not from the air, from within. "You asked to remember," it said. He sank to his knees. The world trembled, soft and infinite. Images spilled through his mind like pages burned too fast to read. The Emperor's face, the golden light of Terra, two shadows standing at his side. And then, a final, unbearable flash. The Emperor turning away, hand raised not in blessing but in command. Erasure as mercy. Time became uncertain after that. He remembered waking again, sometime later, perhaps hours, perhaps days in the upper archives. The servitors moved normally now. The air was still. His own reflection in the polished glass showed the same weary features, though the eyes seemed wrong, darker, less human. He checked the records. The spool was gone. So were the access logs. Even the Lex Mechanic showed no trace of the file. Only one fragment of text remained, pulsing faintly on a dormant terminal. Two names, one silence eternal. He printed it out of habit more than purpose and folded it into his sleeve. But when he looked for the vault door again, the corridor itself was missing. In its place was only smooth stone, unbroken, as if no door had ever been there at all. The archive had healed, or forgotten. The administratum sent an inquiry some weeks later. A new scribe arrived to audit the stacks. Corin greeted him politely, his manner calm. He showed the young man the indexes, the shelves, the catalogs. Everything was in order. The redactions were clean. The scribe smiled, satisfied, and asked only one question as he prepared to leave. "Archivist," he said softly, "what does this mean?" He held up a small slip of parchment he had found wedged behind a data core. It bore a child's handwriting, uneven and trembling. "Father will come." Corin stared for a long time. Then he smiled, gentle, as though the words meant nothing at all. "Old superstition," he said. "A remnant of the early crusade. You'll find such nonsense everywhere in the older files." The scribe nodded, returned the slip, and left. When the door closed, Corin sat alone in the silence. He could hear the hum of the Lex Mechanic again, a rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. He whispered not to the Emperor, not to the machine god, but to the silence itself. "I remember." The hum deepened, and from far within the archive, a low, answering tone replied. That night Corin dreamed again. He stood upon a plain of shattered glass, beneath a sky filled with lightning that never struck. The horizon was lined with shapes, great towers of bone and steel, half buried, half alive. Between them moved two figures, immense and radiant, their faces hidden by shadow. They turned toward him, and their voices came as one, layered and infinite. "We were not lost. We were taken away. He feared what we became." He tried to speak, but his voice was not his own. It was younger, childlike, and it carried the same cadence as the lullaby. The taller figure reached out. Its hand was light and darkness both. When it touched his brow, he felt the entire archive within him, every record, every whisper, every erasure. All the forgotten things rushed through his mind like blood through open veins. He awoke gasping, and the Lex Mechanic before him was already spinning. The spool he had destroyed had reappeared new, whole, waiting. He could have turned away. He should have. Instead, he leaned forward, pressed the activation rune, and let it play one last time. The final recording was short, only a few seconds. A child's laughter, the sound of rain, and then a voice that was unmistakable. The Emperor's. It spoke softly, almost sorrowfully. "I made you from my light, and you became my shadow." Then silence. Corin sat very still. He understood then the truth not of history, but of intention. The Emperor had not destroyed his lost sons out of wrath, nor grief, nor shame. He had done it to save the galaxy from knowing what they had become, reflections of his own divinity, unrestrained, infinite, uncontrollable. Not lost, not dead, simply hidden, waiting. In the days that followed, Corin no longer trusted his memory. He would find himself standing before shelves he did not recall building, reading entries he had never written. The servitors addressed him as Magister, but he could not remember when the promotion had come. Sometimes, when the lamps dimmed, he caught sight of two figures reflected faintly in the glass, standing just behind him, patient and silent. Other times, he would hear the soft hum of a child's song threading through the archive corridors, echoing endlessly between the metal ribs of the vaults. The tune was always the same. One evening, or what passed for evening here, Corin found a note on his desk, written in the same hand as before. The archive remembers us, so must you. There was no signature. He folded it carefully, placed it beside the old fragment of parchment, and turned off the lights. The archive sighed in darkness, metal settling like old bones. He stood there for a long time, eyes closed, listening. Somewhere in the endless hush of the stacks, a servitor began to hum the lullaby. Another joined, then another. Soon, the whole vault seemed to breathe with the sound, low, mechanical voices woven with something eerily human. He smiled faintly. The sound was beautiful, terrible, and as he stood among the sleeping machines, Corin whispered the final words, his voice barely more than a breath. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting. The archive answered with silence, and somewhere beyond the veil of the Imperium, two forgotten suns stirred.